Hello, and welcome to the channel of Thomas to the Maximus. Today, I'm here to make an analysis of a Thomas and Friends episode. A Series 1 episode. Series 1, where the show began all the way back in 1984, where many people's childhood began, where many people's fascination with railways began, where the Blue Tank Engine's head-on popularity began, where the fan base mostly began, and where many parents' frustration at the repetitive nature of their children began, including my parents. Series 1 might be my favorite. Or maybe Series 3. Or 4. Probably 4. But I do have a soft spot for Series 1. It's turning 40 years old today, so I thought it would be appropriate to talk about an episode I'm rather fond of. Most people talk about The Flying Kipper. While I do think it is a good episode, I don't have much to say that hasn't already been said. Apart from, I love David Mitten's clever directing of not showing the goods train's crew get out of the brake van in time. If you watch this with no narration, it's as if they perished in the crash. Also, could we please take a moment to really admire the detail in this scene? The calendar, the portrait of that woman, the lantern, the books, etc. So much detail. I also love the spring atmosphere when Henry returns from crew, symbolizing his renewal and the passage of time. Also, is it me, or does this harbor set have actual water by the quay? It's not plastic water with ripples or sheets of black plastic, like on the windmill set, or the mountain set. I read in the 1992 model Trains magazine during Series 3's production that they used black plastic sheets and filled in half an inch of water for when they were filming boats crossing the waters. Since we're talking about Series 1, I love the attention to detail this series. For example, in Thomas in Trouble, you can hear the telephone ring before the butler comes in.
The fat controller was having breakfast. He was eating toast and marmalade. The butler came in.
Or in Thomas Goes Fishing, there's visible rust on Thomas's filler cap. Also, I love the detail of Sir Topham Hatt's car consistently appearing on the set whenever he's present, almost every time. The attention to detail is really remarkable. There are of course other episodes that I could talk about, but I don't have much to say. Thomas and Gordon, the first episode for the show, while great, I don't have any major points to make. And the second episode that aired alongside it, Edward and Gordon, as much as I love that episode, and I watched it many times as a child, I don't have much to say. Apart from that, it's very clever that Thomas and Gordon is the first story, about Thomas and Gordon as the first two stars, with Thomas getting into a mishap after being rude, showing us he's very flawed, and then Edward and Gordon as it introduces us to the first character in the books. And then we see Gordon get into a mishap after being rude, showing us both Thomas and Gordon are flawed. And by down the line, they've made so many silly mistakes they formed their alliance. Also, something that came to my mind a while ago about Edward and Gordon. In the book, Gordon has a lawn train. In William Middleton's print, he has at least 15 trucks. In Clarence Reginald Dalby's illustration, he has at least 11 trucks, as well as in The Adventure Begins. So although his crew confirmed he wasn't trying, it was made more debatable this way. Whereas in the television series, however, he's pulling about 5. Which is probably an indicator he really isn't trying. I'm not sure if that's better or worse. Also, the turntable theme being sped up while James is spun around on the turntable is honestly so clever. Apart from that, I don't have much to say about Series 1 that hasn't already been said. However, there is one episode I've particularly grown to appreciate, and that episode is Percy Runs Away. Percy Runs Away, the 17th episode of Series 1, and Percy's first main role, if you don't count Trouble in the Shed, when he was introduced. This one's going to be interesting, as not only is this Percy's first episode as a main character, this is also his only episode as a main character in Series 1. Every other major character in Series 1 had more than one episode with them as the main character, or had an arc spanning over a few episodes, at least 3 or 2. but Percy only got one. I guess you could say Edward only got one episode too. However, I feel Edward was a lot more active than him, even in episodes where he wasn't the main character. Before we talk about this episode, I'd like to briefly discuss Percy's character. What we know of Percy's character so far. He originates from the workshops on the mainland, and is the first engine named by Sir Topham Hatt himself.
I'll call you Percy. Yes, sir, thank you, sir, said Percy.
Percy's cheeky, maybe even cheekier than Thomas, as shown in this episode where he teases the other engines.
Percy was left alone. He didn't mind that a bit. He liked watching trains and being cheeky to the other engines. Hurry, 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 he would call, and they got very cross.
However, there's a difference between Thomas and Percy. Most of Thomas's cheekiness comes from his ego, whereas Percy's cheekiness comes from payback. While Percy is capable of being cheeky without being provoked like Thomas, he'll mostly do it towards someone who is rude to him, as shown in Trouble in the Shed. Percy is respectful and instantly loyal to Sir Topham Hatt.
If I choose you, will you work hard? Oh, sir, yes, sir. That's a good engine.
He's also respectful toward Edward. However, when Henry comes in and rudely hisses at them,
When Henry jumped and ran back to the shed.
Percy wheeshes back. This side to his character is expanded on more in Series 2, where Percy shows a more expanded variety of emotions and character traits, such as depression, or shame, or his smug, feisty, naive, timid, hot-tempered, snappy, hardworking, somewhat accident-prone side, and even misbehaved and vengeful side. Contrast to this series, where he's consistently smiling, nearly always cheerful or cheeky. Now, this isn't something exclusive to Percy. Other characters such as Bertie, Terence, or even Edward have a habit of smiling a lot this series. I just feel with Percy in particular it's noteworthy, especially with how expressive he is in the later series. In fact, ever since we've been introduced to him, he's been smiling. As for other noteworthy moments from Percy this series, barring Percy runs away, which I will soon get to, in Dirty Objects, Percy joins Toby at teasing James.
Look here, Percy, exclaimed Toby. Whatever is that dirty object? That's James, didn't you know? It's James's shape, said Toby. But James is a splendid red engine, and you never see his paint dirty. James pretended he hadn't heard.
Despite being cheeky, Percy is somewhat more friendly than Thomas. In Trouble in the Shed, after he wheeshes at Henry and Edward compliments him, Percy modestly says his wheeshing is nothing compared to the workshop, showing he's a bit more humble than Thomas, or the big engines. In fact, apart from Edward, Percy's practically the only likable one in the main cast. Thomas is cheeky and somewhat naughty, Henry is grumpy and cynical, Gordon is arrogant and prideful, and James is vain, hot-tempered, and egotistical, and all of them are consistently very selfish and rude. Contrast to Edward and Percy. Edward is kind, wise, and mature, and Percy is cheeky, but more chipper, innocent, and well-behaved than Thomas. In a group where our main characters are so cynical, it's nice to have a character the kids can relate to more. I imagine Edward got along with Percy very quickly after putting up with the big engine's rude behavior. In Whistles and Sneezes, when Gordon is harassing Henry for his whistling, Percy comforts him.
Never mind, whispered Percy. I'm glad you're home again. I like your whistling.
As a matter of fact, both Edward and Percy seem to be the only engines who sympathize with Henry. Gordon didn't insult Henry for his illness, but did taunt him for his poor choice leading to him being bricked up, and criticizes his whistling. James tells Henry he doesn't work hard enough, and Thomas calls Henry fat and tells him he needs to exercise, just because he was late. Thomas only showed concern for Henry being ill once in Thomas's train, and even then, in the book, he's smiling, implying all he cares about is getting to pull his train. And in the series finale, Thomas's Christmas party, Mrs. Kindly befriends Percy, alongside Thomas and Toby, and Percy assists by taking the workmen home.
Thomas and Toby are all friends, she said, and now, Percy, you are my friend too. Percy was very pleased. 3 cheers for Mrs. Kindly, he called.
Also, considering how cheeky and accident-prone Percy is in all eras of the franchise, I find it remarkable that apart from weeshing back at Henry, he's actually very well behaved throughout his introduction, and helped Thomas and Edward run the railway for apparently several days, and only until Percy runs away does he get into trouble. Speaking of which, we now come to the moment you've all been waiting for. Percy runs away. After the big engines are released from the sheds due to their strike, Sir Topham Hatt tells Percy, Edward, and Thomas that they're allowed to play on the branch lines for a while, which makes sense since they've mostly been worried about the main line because of the strike, so sending them to work on the branch lines is actually a smart move. Thomas leaves with Annie and Clarabelle, while Edward goes to the quarry. Percy stays in the yard and acts cheeky toward the big engines. Then he arranges some trucks on the main line, leaves them in a siding, and runs back to the junction. And this is where I would like to praise David Mitten's directing skills here. So far, things are fairly swell for our main character, accompanied by the big station theme, which fades out with this flute note. Then there's no music as Percy runs up to the signal box, and all we can hear is the birds chirping and Percy idling, and Percy is still smiling, showing his spirit is unbeatable, and he's somewhat looking around and admiring the world around him, and meanwhile, the narrator informs us of Percy's small error.
After a great deal of shunting, Percy was waiting for the signalman to set the point so that he could get back to the yard. He was eager to work, but was being rather careless and not paying attention. Edward had warned Percy, "Be careful on the main line, whistle to the signalman you are there." But Percy didn't remember to whistle, so the busy signalman forgot him.
That doesn't sound like a big deal. Percy will just have to wait for who knows how long. To us, the audience, that doesn't seem to carry danger. What's so scary about waiting for the signalman? And Percy clearly isn't bothered by waiting. Speaking of Percy's unbeatable spirit and patience, I feel like Percy smiling while waiting would actually be a good tip for dealing with impatience. If you get impatient easily, and something you're waiting for is taking a long time, perhaps you should try imitating Percy's smiling face and see if it helps. I think I'll try it the next time I'm starting to grow impatient. Anyway, after we're told Percy has forgotten to whistle to the signalman, this happens.
Percy waited and waited. The points were still against him, so he couldn't move. Then he looked along the main line. Peep, peep! He whistled in horror, for rushing straight towards him was Gordon with the express. "Oh!" groaned Gordon. "Get out of my way!" Percy opened his eyes. Gordon had stopped with Percy's buffers a few inches from his own.
Wow. There is so much in that scene I'd like to analysis. Firstly, when the narrator tells us Edward earlier warned Percy about whistling to the signalman, it's just told to us, not shown. There's no flashback where Edward visibly warns Percy. Normally, the show, don't tell rule would be the better choice, but I think in this case, it works better, as visually, it's just Percy chilling by the signal box, and without a flashback, we, the audience, are taken more by surprise. Secondly, right after the narrator tells us Percy forgot to whistle to the signalman, if you listen carefully, you can hear fast puffing sounds in the background. It's also effective because we're not told who it is yet. It could be any engine. That's a good detail. Thirdly, we get a close-up of Percy's whistle before we see him shocked, accompanied by that brass ditty, implying he sees the danger before we do. Speaking of which, it's insane to believe that this shot is the first time we see Percy change his facial expressions. From the moment we were introduced to him, to the scene of him waiting at the signal box, Percy has consistently been smiling. So I feel this is David Mitten's way of saying, if little Percy's frightened instead of being cheerful, you know something is seriously wrong. Fourthly, Ringo Starr then pauses when explaining to us who it is,
For rushing straight towards him,
leaving the audience in brief suspension to who it is as the camera stays facing Percy. Then Ringo finishes his sentence as the camera is now facing the main line, showing us that the oncoming engine
was Gordon with the express.
And now the audience is terrified that it's Gordon. Of all the engines Percy could be in a collision with, it's Gordon, coming straight at him at likely 65 miles per hour. I don't know for sure and I'm not doing the math. Coincidentally, apart from the beginning, where the big engines promise to behave, we don't see Gordon or hear him directly mentioned in this episode until now. And apart from Gordon screaming,
"Oh, get out of my way!"
there's no narration in this moment, which also makes it scarier. There were originally some extra lines in the book where Percy's driver tries to reverse him and urges him to back up, and some narration about Gordon coming closer every second. However, here, they instead took the needless narration out and let the visuals do the explaining. It's just Percy frantically looking around for a way to escape as Gordon comes closer, with shots of him coming closer from Percy's point of view. Sixthly, it's also somewhat scarier by the fact that instead of screaming for help, Percy just stays looking terrified. Imagine that from his point of view. An engine about 4 times bigger than him, charging at him at likely 60 miles per hour. Seventhly, then we get a close-up of Percy shutting his eyes, waiting for the end, while his crew jump clear, and in the background, we can hear Gordon coming closer as his brakes screech. And even when his brakes come on, his puffing sounds aren't slowing down, and don't slow down until we get a close-up of him. And finally, the runaway theme turns into these high-pitched strings as Gordon charges at the camera, putting the audience in suspense if Percy's going to get hit or not. They honestly remind me of Psycho. And thankfully, Gordon just barely stops in time, and the strings end in this deep chord. Then we get a close-up of Gordon, furious at the tank engine in his way, with steam swirling around him from Percy's point of view as the strings fade out, likely symbolizing that the danger is fading away. We just went from Gordon being a couple yards away from Percy to directly in front of him. The pacing of this scene is also impressive. It's slow enough for the audience to grow fear, but fast enough to be suspenseful, and quick enough to showcase how fast your life can be put in danger in just 27.28 seconds. Additionally, both Ringo Starr and George Carlin do a decent performance at this scene.
Oh! Groaned Gordon. Get out of my way!
Everyone and their mother knows Gordon was going to stop in time, but everything in the direction of this scene points to a collision. There wasn't much foreshadowing to this either, apart from Percy forgetting to whistle. It's even more terrifying when you remember other instances where Gordon is pulling the express and something's in his path, and by George, he hits a truck so hard it's thrown in the air and it shatters when it hits the ground. I know a lot of people call this crash unrealistic, and I'm sorry to contradict you. However, my dad told me he saw something similar happen right in front of him. Also, in respect for Gordon, he hit some tankers so hard they burst open. Imagine if both of those were Percy. Also, I know moments where engines stopping just in time is common in this show, but in Series 1 it wasn't. In fact, apart from Thomas and the Trucks and Troublesome Trucks, this is the only time in Series 1 where a character actually stops in time, whereas nearly every other time the crash is usually inevitable, which I feel makes it more tense. And also if you count Mrs. Kindly's Christmas. In the Railway series, there was an extra line about the signalman responding to a message from up the line and setting the signal and points for the next train. I'm glad they removed that line, as there's more tension this way, although I personally feel a bell sound effect could be added to hint at it. In the book, Percy's driver manages to get him moving, but Percy realistically can't start quick enough, whereas here, Percy doesn't start in time at all, making it even scarier. It's even scarier and admittedly sadder when you remember that this story is based on a real-life event that occurred on Christmas Eve, 1910, at 5:49 a.m. at Hawes Junction, where Alfred Sutton, the signalman who was dealing with 9 other light engines and a ton of traffic and special trains for Christmas, forgot about some light engines that he sent down the main line, and they ended up waiting at the advanced starting signal. And they were still waiting 20 minutes later. At 5:39, he was offered the midnight sleeping express car, St. Pancras, Glasgow, which he offered forward to Askill. It was accepted, and at 5:44, he set all his signals to clear. The light engine's crews assumed it was their signal and set off when he set the road for the Scotch Express. When the signal cleared, the light engine started moving, but ended up in the way of the Scotch Express, traveling at 60 miles per hour, running 16 minutes late, and the light engines were moving at 25 miles per hour, and the Scotch Express, unlike Gordon, didn't stop in time, and crashed into them after Moorcock Tunnel. The coaches piled up, and 12 people who wanted to be with their families on Christmas Eve perished, and 17 were injured. To make matters worse, the gas pipes in the coaches, which were used for the lights, started leaking, and the coaches were made from timber, both of which started a fire, and all the coaches, except the brake vans, went up in flames. So many people were burned to death and were unable to move from under the wreckage. In fact, a wife and husband, Mr. and Mrs. Gray, saw their at least 4-month-old baby being burned to death, crying in agony, and they couldn't get to their child because they were wedged under the coaches. They lived, but their child didn't. Another engine tried to move the coaches, while the light engine's driver tried to extinguish the fire using water from another engine's tender, but the strong winds prevented it, and only the brake vans on the train could be moved. The engine crews, guards, sleeping car attendants, plate layers, and a shepherd tried to save the passengers, but couldn't. What a horrible way to spend Christmas Eve. A moment of silence for the passengers that perished, please. Imagine if that's how this episode turned out. If it was in winter, Gordon likely wouldn't be able to stop in time. Also, imagine how ashamed and remorseful Percy would feel if there really was a fatal crash, knowing so many lives are lost, and it's all his fault, if he would even live to see it, that is. It's pretty insane that Wilbur Awdry used such a heartbreaking story for a Railway series story, where, as he says, the happy ending is very important. To think about all of Percy's mishaps in the show, or the many life-threatening situations he's put in, this is where it all started. And this isn't the last time he has a near miss with Gordon. Along with his timid side, Percy being terrified of something becomes rather common in later series, and this is where it all began. Percy is so terrified, he races away from the signal box, through the station, and over the hill. Side note, I love the camera panning and zooming out shots here. I don't see that much during runaway scenes in Series 1. Percy wants to stop, but can't, since his crew jumped out before he raced away. Finally, another signalman switches him onto a siding with a bank of earth. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is Percy's first somewhat crash. He doesn't seem to be damaged, and he stays on the rails. Compared to Percy's other crashes, this is pretty tame. George Carlin does a good job at making Percy sound terrified, As Thomas 1 Edward 2 Henry 3 puts it, he makes Percy sound like he's very disturbing.
I want to stop! I want to stop! I want to stop! I want to stop! I have stopped!
I also love the moral, and the way it's told. Being careless in a dangerous setting, or forgetting even one detail, can lead to a major disaster. I really admire how Audrey presented the consequences in such a serious way. A simple moral, with very heavy consequences shown. Although, shouldn't Percy have been scolded by Sir Topham Hatt for his carelessness? Because of him, so many people were very close to death. A very serious accident nearly happened, and only by the grace of God it didn't. And the express was delayed because of him. Not to mention he became a runaway and put himself in danger, and could have crashed into another engine, or hurt someone nearby. Of course he hadn't meant to, and he is new to the railway, however, it was still irresponsible regardless. As the workmen dig Percy out, oh hello Ringo, Gordon comes in with a cable, and helps pull him out, and compliments him for stopping an accident by starting quickly, which made more sense in the Railway series. And that brings me to 3 positive points for both this episode and the story in the book. 1. Gordon is showing a moment of kindness here. It isn't until his book where he really starts to mellow out. But instead of being furious at Percy for holding up the Express, he leaves the Express to help Percy, and compliments him, which is a nice character moment for him. 2. Percy apologizes for being cheeky, something Thomas has hardly ever done, which yet again shows he's friendlier than Thomas.
I'm sorry I was cheeky, said Percy. You were clever to stop.
Apart from apologizing to Terence, Thomas never really apologizes for his cheeky behavior until down the mine, where he and Gordon form an alliance. But that's another story. And 3. Even though Percy doesn't have a big arc this series, he sure learned his lesson a lot quicker than the other main characters did. The other engines would make more than one mistake, get scolded, and then in the next story redeem themselves of their mistake, and earn Sir Topham Hatt's respect again, whereas all Percy did was act cheeky, make the mistake of forgetting to whistle, and all he needed was one good scare, being run to exhaustion, and he was already whipped into shape. All the other characters needed to progress and grow, whereas Percy just vibes at a signal box until Gordon almost hits him. And for the rest of Series 1, Percy doesn't make any more mistakes. He may have going by the Railway series, but Percy and the Trousers got moved to Series 3, so I'm not counting it. In terms of Series 1, this is it. Percy consistently stays out of trouble after this, and isn't that cheeky. The episode's final line even tells us this.
Percy is still cheeky because he is that sort of engine, but he is always most careful when he goes on the main line.
So although he didn't have an entire arc of episodes, he sure learned his lesson a lot faster than the others. And that is pretty much it. Apart from this episode, and those moments I mentioned, Percy didn't really do a whole lot this series. He was important, of course, but didn't play a very big role. But he didn't need to. Being a little engine, he had his own way of taking part. But this is just the beginning. Well, I hope you enjoyed this analysis on Percy Runs Away. What do you think of this episode? Please leave any thoughts you have on it in the comments below. Happy 40th anniversary to Thomas the Tank Engine and friends. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.